Nigel Farage has just blown the lid off a corruption scandal so massive, so widespread and so absolutely shocking that it makes every other political controversy look like a minor administrative error by comparison. What he's exposed involves not just one or two rogue councils, but a systematic network of fraud, embezzlement and outright theft that has been operating across dozens of Labour-controlled local authorities, stealing millions upon millions of pounds from taxpayers while providing absolutely terrible services to the communities they're supposed to serve. The evidence Farage has presented is devastating and irrefutable, including leaked internal documents, recorded conversations, whistleblower testimony and financial records that trace exactly where the money went and whose pockets it ended up lining. This isn't speculation or political point scoring. This is documented proof of criminal activity happening in plain sight while councillors and their cronies enriched themselves at public expense and ordinary citizens struggled with deteriorating services and rising council taxes. And here's what makes this scandal even more explosive. Keir Starmer has gone completely silent on the issue, refusing to comment despite repeated questions from journalists, declining to condemn the corruption that's been exposed, and apparently hoping that if he just ignores the story, it will somehow go away. But this scandal is too big, too well documented and too damaging to simply disappear. And Starmer's deafening silence is being interpreted by millions of people as a tacit admission that he knows exactly what's been happening in Labour councils and has chosen to protect the corrupt officials rather than stand up for the taxpayers being robbed blind. The establishment media is desperately trying to bury this story because it exposes corruption at the heart of the Labour movement and undermines every claim they make about caring for working people and fighting for social justice. The investigation that led to Farage's explosive revelations began months ago when whistleblowers from multiple councils started reaching out to Reform UK with evidence of systematic financial irregularities and corrupt practices that were being covered up by council leadership and ignored by oversight bodies that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of abuse. And these brave individuals, career local government employees who took their responsibilities seriously and couldn't stomach what they were witnessing, provided detailed documentation showing how council contracts worth tens of millions of pounds were being awarded to companies owned by relatives and associates of councillors, how phantom employees were being added to council payrolls with the salaries going to politically connected individuals who did no actual work, and how council resources, including vehicles, equipment and staff time, were being diverted for private use by senior officials who treated public assets as their personal property. Farage and his team spent months verifying this information, cross-referencing documents, conducting additional interviews and building an airtight case that could withstand legal challenge and media scrutiny. What they discovered was even worse than the initial whistleblower reports suggested, revealing not just isolated incidents of corruption, but an organised system operating across multiple councils with apparent coordination and shared tactics for hiding the theft from auditors and the public. The financial scale of the corruption that Farage has exposed is absolutely staggering, with preliminary estimates suggesting that hundreds of millions of pounds have been stolen from council budgets over the past several years through various schemes and fraudulent arrangements. In one council alone, investigators traced over £20 million in questionable payments made to a network of consulting companies that had no employees, no offices, and no apparent ability to provide the services they were supposedly contracted for. When Farage's team dug deeper, they discovered that these shell companies were registered to addresses that turned out to be the homes of council officials and their family members, making the fraud so blatant that it's shocking nobody in oversight positions caught it earlier, or perhaps more accurately, that nobody in those positions chose to act on what they must have known was happening. Another council was found to have paid enormous sums for construction and maintenance work that was either never performed or was done so poorly that it had to be completely redone, with the companies receiving these payments having clear connections to councillors who voted to approve the contracts. The waste and theft involved represents money that should have been spent on essential services like road repairs, social care, libraries, youth programmes and support for vulnerable residents. Services that have been cut to the bone, while council officials and their associates were literally stealing public funds. The methods used to perpetrate and conceal this corruption demonstrate a level of sophistication and coordination that suggests this wasn't just opportunistic theft by individual bad actors, but an organised system with established procedures and protective mechanisms. Farage's investigation uncovered evidence of deliberate manipulation of procurement processes to ensure that favoured companies would win contracts, regardless of whether they submitted competitive bids or met qualification requirements. Council employees who raised questions about these irregular awards were reassigned, passed over for promotions, or in some cases forced out entirely through manufactured complaints and hostile work environments designed to silence dissent. The audit and oversight mechanisms that should have caught these problems were apparently compromised, with some auditors receiving payments from the same shell companies that were defrauding the councils, creating obvious conflicts of interest that should have disqualified them from conducting supposedly independent reviews. Freedom of information requests that might have exposed the corruption were delayed, denied on spurious grounds, or responded to with heavily redacted documents that concealed the most damaging information. Council meetings where contracts and budgets should have been properly scrutinised were rushed through with minimal discussion, with questioning councillors shouted down or ruled out of order by chairs who were themselves implicated in the schemes being protected. What makes this scandal particularly outrageous is the brazenness with which some of the corruption was conducted, with council officials apparently confident that they could steal public money without consequence because of political protection and the failure of oversight systems. Farage presented evidence of councillors taking luxury foreign holidays that were supposedly official council business but involved no actual work activities and were timed to coincide with family vacations. He detailed cases of council credit cards being used for personal shopping, expensive meals at high-end restaurants, and entertainment expenses that had absolutely nothing to do with legitimate council functions. Some councils were found to have hired family members of senior officials into highly paid positions for which they had no qualifications, with these individuals rarely or never showing up to work but continuing to collect substantial salaries. The corruption extended to the use of council properties, with some officials arranging for council-owned buildings to be rented to companies they controlled at below-market rates, then subletting those same properties at full market value and pocketing the difference. In one particularly egregious example, a council sold valuable public land to a development company for a fraction of its worth, with the company then immediately flipping the property for a massive profit that ended up benefiting individuals connected to the councillors who approved the original sale. The human cost of this corruption is absolutely devastating and represents the real scandal beyond just the financial numbers. Every pound stolen from council budgets is a pound that wasn't available to provide services to residents who desperately needed them. Farage presented heartbreaking testimony from elderly residents whose social care support was cut, forcing them to struggle alone with basic daily tasks or rely on overstretched family members. He shared stories of children whose after-school programmes and youth centres were shut down due to supposed budget constraints, even as millions were being funnelled into corrupt schemes. Disabled residents talked about how essential support services disappeared, leaving them isolated and unable to access their communities. Libraries that served as vital community hubs were closed, parks fell into disrepair, roads became dangerous with potholes, and basic maintenance was neglected, all while council officials claimed there simply wasn't enough money, when the truth is there would have been plenty of money if it hadn't been systematically stolen. The contrast between the deteriorating services experienced by ordinary residents and the comfortable lifestyles enjoyed by the corrupt officials responsible for that deterioration is absolutely sickening and demonstrates the real-world consequences of treating public office as an opportunity for personal enrichment rather than public service. The political dimension of this scandal is equally explosive and explains why Keir Starmer has gone completely silent rather than addressing the corruption that's been exposed. Every single council implicated in Farage's investigation is controlled by Labour, and in many cases the individuals involved in the corrupt activities are active party members, campaign workers and donors who have close connections to the broader Labour political machine. Some of the councillors named in the evidence have hosted fundraising events for Labour, have served as delegates to party conferences and maintain relationships with senior party figures, including MPs and ministers. The corruption revealed at the local level raises obvious questions about whether similar practices might be happening at higher levels of government, whether the culture of entitlement and self-dealing that flourished in these councils reflects broader problems within the Labour movement, and whether party leadership was aware of what was happening and chose to turn a blind eye rather than cleaning house and holding wrongdoers accountable. Starmer's silence on this scandal is being interpreted as a deliberate choice to protect political allies rather than standing up for the principles of clean government and accountability that Labour claims to champion. The media's response to Farage's revelations has been absolutely telling about which outlets prioritise actual journalism over political loyalty and narrative management. Some news organisations have given the story prominent coverage and conducted their own follow-up investigations to verify and expand on what Farage revealed, recognising this as a legitimate scandal of major public importance regardless of the political implications. But other outlets, particularly those that have traditionally been sympathetic to Labour, have either ignored the story entirely or buried it with minimal coverage that downplays the severity and systematic nature of what's been exposed. This selective coverage is itself becoming part of the scandal, with many people recognising that if these were Conservative councils involved in identical corruption, the coverage would be relentless and the calls for accountability would be deafening. The double standard is so obvious and so blatant that it's further undermining public trust in mainstream media and driving more people to alternative sources that are willing to cover stories, regardless of whether they're politically convenient for the established parties and their media allies. The legal and regulatory response to Farage's revelations is beginning to unfold, with law enforcement agencies confirming they are reviewing the evidence and considering what investigations and potential prosecutions might be warranted. The Serious Fraud Office has indicated that the scale and systematic nature of the alleged corruption falls within their remit, and they are examining whether to launch formal investigations into the councils and individuals involved. Local government oversight bodies are facing intense pressure to explain how such extensive corruption was able to continue for so long without being detected or stopped by the mechanisms that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of abuse. Some of these oversight bodies are now themselves facing questions about whether they were complicit in the cover-up, whether they ignored warning signs because of political considerations, or whether they're simply so incompetent that they failed to catch obvious fraud happening right under their noses. The calls for reform of local government oversight and audit processes are growing louder, with recognition that the current system clearly isn't working if this level of corruption can flourish unchecked for years. The political fallout from this council corruption scandal is accelerating and threatens to become yet another crisis for a Labour Party and government already reeling from multiple scandals and historically low approval ratings. Opposition parties are demanding that Starmer break his silence and explain what he knew about the corruption in Labour councils, when he knew it, and what he did or failed to do in response. They're calling for a comprehensive investigation, not just of the specific councils implicated, but of Labour-controlled local authorities across the country, to determine whether the corruption exposed by Farage represents isolated problems or a systematic pattern that reflects deeper cultural issues within the party.